The gravel crunched under Liam's tires, a sound both familiar and unsettling. He hadn't been back to the old Henderson place in nearly 20 years. Not since his mother had passed, and his father had sold it to a quiet, elderly couple who seemed to do nothing with it but let it sit. Now, driven by a mixture of nostalgia and an inexplicable pull, Liam found himself parked in the overgrown driveway, his breath catching in his throat. The house stood silent, a hulking silhouette against the pale afternoon sky. It still wore the same faded blue paint, the same slightly askew shutters. It was precisely as he remembered, yet profoundly alien. He killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy, pregnant with the ghosts of his childhood. This house, for all its physical presence, had never truly felt like a home. It was a sterile environment, a place of hushed tones and averted gazes, dominated by his father's stoic, emotionally distant nature and his mother's fragile, almost ethereal presence. Liam had always felt like an outsider within its walls, a temporary resident in a life he hadn't chosen. Yet here he was, drawn back to its quiet despair. He pushed open the car door, the squeak a jarring interruption. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell deeply ingrained in his memory. He walked up the cracked concrete path, each step a small echo. His father had always said the house had good bones, but Liam remembered a different kind of foundation. He knew the house held secrets. Not the kind discovered in dusty attics, but the kind quietly buried beneath the surface, in the very marrow of the structure. The key, surprisingly, still fit the lock. It turned with a sticky protest, a reluctant invitation. The front door groaned open, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. The furniture, draped in faded white sheets, loomed like shrouded figures. He stepped inside, the air instantly cooler, carrying the faint, musty odor of disuse. This was the starting point, the physical manifestation of a past he had spent years trying to outrun. He moved through the silent rooms, his footsteps unnervingly loud. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen, all frozen in time. Each space evoked a flicker of memory, a phantom sensation. The worn armchair by the fireplace where his father read, the chipped china cabinet where his mother kept her few prized possessions. But beneath these surface recollections, a deeper unease stirred. He felt a subtle wrongness, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with age or neglect. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. His childhood bedroom was upstairs, a small, cramped space with a window that overlooked the overgrown backyard. He stood in the doorway, a pang of coldness, not from the temperature, but from within. He remembered sneaking out this window as a teenager, desperate for any escape. Now the room just felt empty, a vessel that had once contained a boy longing for something more, something he couldn't articulate. He had always felt an absence here, a void that no amount of toys or books could fill. What was it he was truly looking for in this place? That's when his gaze fell to the basement door. It was usually kept locked, a dark, foreboding portal that his father had always warned him away from. He had never understood the fear associated with it, but the prohibition had always been absolute. His father's intensity whenever the basement was mentioned still sent a shiver down his spine. There was always something more to this house than met the eye, a hidden layer that even his father seemed determined to keep buried deeper than the earth itself. He felt a strange compulsion, an urge he couldn't quite explain, pulling him not towards the familiar upstairs, but down into the shadowed depths his father had so sternly guarded. And real quick, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more scary stories just like this. Now, let's keep moving. The basement stairs creaked ominously with each descending step, a mournful chorus accompanying Liam's descent. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the distinct smell of damp concrete and something vaguely metallic, a scent that prickled at the back of his throat. His father had kept the basement sparsely furnished, mostly tools and storage, a utilitarian space devoid of any personal touch. It was the one part of the house Liam had actively avoided, a place that held no fond memories, only a pervasive sense of unease he could never quite shake. He reached the bottom and flicked the light switch. A weak, flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating stacks of old boxes, forgotten furniture draped in cobwebs, and his father's workbench, still cluttered with tools that looked like they belonged to another era. Liam ran a hand over the cool, rough concrete floor. It felt solid, unyielding. He'd always assumed the basement was just a basement, nothing more. The pervasive dread he associated with it seemed irrational, a childish fear of the dark magnified by his father's stern warnings. Then he heard it. A faint, grinding sound, almost imperceptible at first, like stone scraping against stone. He froze, straining his ears. It was intermittent, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete itself. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the basement, peering into the shadowy corners, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It wasn't the house settling. It was more deliberate, more mechanical. His eyes fell on the far wall, partially obscured by a towering, dilapidated shelving unit his father had built years ago. The shelves were overloaded with paint cans, old jars, and various dusty odds and ends, a testament to his father's tendency to hold on to things. The wall behind it looked like any other section of unfinished concrete, rough and gray. Yet the grinding sound seemed to emanate from that direction, growing slightly louder as he approached. Curiosity, a dangerous companion, began to outweigh his apprehension. What could be making such a noise down here? Rats? But it sounded too heavy, too consistent. He reached the shelving unit and cautiously began to move the items, carefully placing them on the floor. As he cleared the shelves, he uncovered a section of the concrete wall that seemed different. It wasn't as uniformly gray. Bits of darker material, almost like rough mortar, were visible. He tapped the wall with his knuckles. Instead of the solid thud of concrete, there was a hollower sound in one specific area. He tapped again, harder this time. The grinding sound seemed to momentarily cease, then resume, as if in response. A strange chill, unrelated to the basement's temperature, crawled up his spine. This wasn't just a wall. Something was built into it. Something that was either active or struggling. Liam found a crowbar leaning against the workbench. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the tool heavy in his hand. His father had always discouraged this kind of exploration, preferring a predictable, ordered existence. But the sound, the unnerving hollowness, compelled him. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into a crack in the mortar near the unusual section of the wall. With a deep breath, he applied pressure. The mortar crumbled, showering him with dust. The grinding intensified, a frantic, rasping sound now. It was as if whatever was behind the wall knew he was there. He pulled harder, the crowbar groaning. A larger section of the mortar gave way, revealing not solid concrete, but a dark, uneven gap. The grinding stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence that felt even more potent than the noise. He peered into the darkness, his heart pounding. What was he finding behind solid walls in his childhood home? Liam continued to pry at the edges of the gap, the crowbar biting into the rough mortar with a grating sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, profound silence of the basement. The air grew thick with fine dust, a gritty powder that settled on his clothes and stung his eyes. He blinked, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of gray across his forehead. The silence was unnerving. He'd expected the grinding to resume or perhaps a crash, something to break the oppressive stillness. Instead, it was as if whatever had been making the noise had simply stopped. He knelt closer, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and peered into the opening. It was dark, a blackness that seemed to absorb the weak basement light. He could smell something now, faint but distinct. Not the musty smell of damp earth, but something else, something old. Like dried wood, but with an underlying sweetness, sickly and cloying. His father had always kept this area of the basement clear of unnecessary clutter, claiming structural integrity, but Liam had never bought it. There had always been a weird insistence about this particular section of wall. He worked the crowbar more assertively now, widening the opening. More mortar crumbled, falling in dusty clumps onto the concrete floor. He could see now that what he was breaking through wasn't just a section of concrete, it was an old bricked-up doorway. The bricks were old, irregular, and crudely cemented in place. It was a deliberate sealing, a purposeful concealment. Why would his father go to such length to wall off an old doorway in the basement? He finally managed to dislodge a brick. It tumbled out with a soft thud, revealing a sliver of deeper darkness beyond. He shone his phone's flashlight into the gap, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the void. It was too deep, too absolute. He felt a growing sense of dread, mixed with an almost unbearable curiosity. This was more than just a forgotten room. It felt like a tomb. With renewed effort, he continued to tear away at the bricks. They came loose more easily now, some crumbling entirely into dust, others revealing more of the dark opening. The smell intensified. That strange, sweet, woody odor. And beneath it, a faint, almost metallic tang. He could hear his own heartbeat thrumming in his ears, a frantic drum against the silence. His father had never spoken of this, never hinted at anything more than a simple, utilitarian basement. Had he known it was here? Or had his father, who was always so keen on maintaining control, put it here? As he pulled away the last few bricks, the opening became large enough for him to see. It was a doorway, just as he suspected. And through it, he could glimpse something. Not just darkness, but a faint, diffused light, like an old, unlit lamp. There was a stillness to it that was profoundly unsettling. The air here felt different too, stagnant, untouched by the passage of time. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to step through, to confront whatever lay beyond the sealed barrier. It was as if the wall itself had been a cage, and whatever was inside was finally being set free. He could feel a subtle pressure against his skin, a faint static in the air. As the last brick fell away, a wave of intensely cold air rushed out from the opening, carrying with it that peculiar, almost perfumed aroma. It was like breathing in the scent of forgotten memories. He stood frozen, the crowbar still in his hand, staring into the black rectangle. He had expected old storage, perhaps a forgotten pantry. He had not expected this. This felt like an invitation, or perhaps a warning. He couldn't see clearly what was inside, but he could make out shapes. Faint outlines of furniture, perhaps? A strange, almost milky light seemed to emanate from somewhere within. Not bright, but pervasive, like perpetual twilight. He wondered if the sealed nature meant it was a part of the original house his father had forgotten, or something else entirely. He had always felt that this house was more than just walls and paint. He wondered, with a shiver, if he was about to discover just how much more. The darkness beyond the opening seemed to beckon, promising answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Liam stepped through the ragged opening, the crowbar still clutched in his hand. The cold air washed over him again, more intensely this time, carrying that unnerving, sweetish smell. He fumbled for his phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick gloom. What he saw made him stop cold. It wasn't a forgotten storage space. It was a room, perfectly preserved, as if time had simply forgotten to touch it. And it was, unmistakably, from the 1970s. The walls were covered in a faded floral wallpaper, a pattern of oversized muted blooms in shades of ochre and muted green. A thick shag carpet, a jarring avocado green, covered the floor, muffling his footsteps. In the center of the room sat a low dark wood coffee table, its surface bare. To his left, a plush burnt orange sofa and matching armchair, their fabric worn smooth in places but otherwise intact. A small, portable record player sat on a side table, a vinyl record still on the turntable. It was like stepping onto a movie set, a perfectly rendered tableau of a bygone era. But there was no dust, none at all. The surfaces gleamed faintly under his phone's light. The furniture looked as if it had been recently sat on, the edges of the cushions slightly indented. The air was unusually still, devoid of the usual mustiness of disuse. It was as if this room had been hermetically sealed, protected from the decay that had claimed the rest of the house. His father, a man of practicality and stark modernity, would never have decorated like this. This was a mystery layered upon a mystery. He walked further in, his eyes scanning the details. A stack of old magazines lay on the coffee table. Life, Look, National Geographic. Their covers faded but legible. He picked one up, a National Geographic from 1973. The paper felt crisp, not brittle. He turned a page, revealing an advertisement for a new transistor radio. It all felt impossibly real, impossibly preserved. How long had this room been here, hidden behind that brick wall? Who had furnished it? And why? He reached out and touched the back of the sofa. The fabric was surprisingly soft, cool to the touch. He could almost feel the texture of the past beneath his fingertips. He looked back at the opening he had created in the wall. The rough, unfinished concrete of the basement seemed alien and out of place now, a stark contrast to the meticulously crafted environment he was standing in. He realized with a jolt that he had been so focused on the room, he hadn't noticed the sound of the basement door closing. He spun around. The rough opening was still there, but the entrance from the basement was gone. The bricked-up wall was seamless again, smooth and undisturbed, as if he had imagined the whole thing. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He ran to the wall, his fingers tracing the surface. It was solid concrete. He thumped it with his fist. Nothing. It was as if it had never been broken. He was trapped. Then, the lights. A soft, diffused glow emanated from a large globe-shaped lamp in the corner. It flickered erratically for a moment, then settled into a steady, warm illumination. The light felt strange, not like normal electricity. It pulsed with a subtle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. As the light intensified, the floral wallpaper seemed to shift subtly, the patterns appearing to deepen and swirl. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, and then the voices. Faint at first, like distant radio static. They whispered his name. Soft, sibilant sounds that seemed to weave through the very fabric of the room. They were coming from everywhere, from the walls, the carpet, the air itself. They were indistinct, luring, promising something just beyond his grasp. He stood frozen, his heart hammering, the crowbar now feeling utterly useless. This was not a preserved room. This was a trap. Liam's breath hitched in his throat. The hushed whispers, once faint, began to coalesce, forming fragments of words that danced just at the edge of comprehension. They weren't aggressive, not at first. They were seductive, like secrets being shared in the dark. "Liam," they murmured, voices overlapping, indistinguishable male and female. "You're home." The floral wallpaper seemed to breathe, the colors deepening, the blooms appearing to swell and recede. He felt a dizzying sense of disorientation, as if the room itself was subtly shifting around him. a disquieting sensation of being both inside and outside himself. He backed away from the wall, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an explanation, a rationalization, but there was none. The walls were solid, the floral pattern mesmerizingly stable, the avocado green carpet firm beneath his feet. He touched the record player again. The record was still in place, a dark, unmarked vinyl. He couldn't recall his parents ever owning a record player, let alone one like this. Every detail screamed 1970s, but it felt wrong, too perfect, too clean. "Don't be afraid, Liam," a voice whispered, closer now, seeming to emanate from the plush armchair. It was soft, almost maternal. He flinched, his muscles tensing. He looked at the armchair, but saw only the worn, burnt orange fabric. Yet he felt a presence there, a silent observer. His mother had been frail, her voice often a whisper, but there had been no static, no distortion. This was something else entirely. Then, his gaze fell upon a small, dark wooden cabinet tucked into a corner near the globe lamp. It was similar in style to the coffee table and side tables, its dark wood gleaming under the strange light. On top of it sat a reel-to-reel tape recorder, something he hadn't seen outside of a museum. Beside it lay a small stack of tapes, their labels handwritten in a neat, unfamiliar script. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This felt like the source. He approached the cabinet cautiously, as if it might bite. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow, intensifying as he neared the tape recorder. They seemed to be urging him on, a silent, insistent prod. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up one of the tapes. The label read, in simple block letters, "The First Day." His mother's handwriting? It was similar, but flatter, lacking her usual cursive flourish. He set the tape down on the coffee table, his fingers brushing against a stack of old National Geographic magazines. He picked up another tape. Week 2. Then another. Remember When. The titles were cryptic, vague. He felt a growing sense of dread, of a story unfolding that he was now inexplicably a part of. His father's methodical nature, his mother's quiet melancholy. They had always felt like incomplete narratives. But this room, this bizarre time-locked sanctuary, felt like a collection of fragments waiting to be pieced together. He looked back at the wall, at the spot where the doorway had been. He ran his hands over the smooth, unbroken concrete. It was as if he had imagined it, as if the opening had never existed. The voices, however, were undeniable. They seemed to emanate from the very air, a low, incessant murmur that was both comforting and deeply disturbing. He felt a peculiar compulsion to play one of the tapes, to understand what he had stumbled into. The room seemed to cradle him, to absorb his fear, and yet he felt a creeping terror, a realization that this was not a place of comfort, but something far more sinister. He picked up the tape labeled "The First Day." His fingers felt clumsy as he navigated the complex mechanics of the old recorder, a machine from an era he had only read about. The tape began to hiss, a sound that mingled unsettlingly with the whispered voices. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't just renovating a basement. He had stepped into something that had been waiting for him. He pressed the play button. The hiss of the tape recorder filled the unnervingly quiet room, a brittle sound that seemed magnified by the silence. Liam pressed his ear closer to the speaker, strain in his posture. Static bled into the sound, a low, persistent hum that made the already distorted voices even more muffled. He could still hear the whispers around him, a ghostly chorus that seemed to react to the playback, growing slightly louder, more insistent, as the tape began to unfold. He realized then that the whispers weren't just ambient noise. They were a part of this place, a constant spectral presence. A distorted, disembodied voice crackled from the tape player. It was male, deep, but laced with an unnerving tremor like a faulty transmission. "Day 1, the voice began, each word a struggle against the static. "It's different now. The walls, they breathe." Liam's eyes flickered to the floral wallpaper. He could swear he saw the pattern's pulse, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that mirrored his own growing dread. This recording wasn't just describing it. It was living it. "I tried to find a way out," the voice continued, strained. "The basement. It's gone. Or changed. The door. It resealed itself, like a promise broken." Liam gripped the edge of the coffee table, his knuckles white. This was it. The proof. The voice described exactly what had happened to him. But who was this man? His father? His voice sounded younger, more broken than Liam remembered him ever being, even in his father's later, quieter years. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the tape, cutting through the man's strained voice. A soft, rhythmic thud, like something being dragged across a rough surface. It was slow, deliberate, and seemed to resonate not just from the speaker, but from the very floor beneath his feet. Liam looked down at the avocado green carpet. It was thick, soft, and utterly still. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. It felt like it was coming from under the carpet now. He recoiled, his heart leaping into his throat. The thudding grew more pronounced, a heavy, dragging sound that now seemed to be directly beneath him. He could feel a faint vibration through the soles of his shoes. It wasn't the tape. Something was moving within the floor. He stared at the carpet, his mind racing. His father had always insisted the house was sound, well built. But what if that was a lie? A carefully constructed facade. "What is that sound?" Liam whispered, his voice barely audible above the tape. The whispers in the room seemed to sharpen, to become more distinct, as if reacting to his question. They weren't words, not quite, but more like a chorus of hushed sighs and rustles, a sound that suggested unseen movement. The thudding beneath the carpet intensified, a palpable sense of something heavy and insistent being dragged inch by agonizing inch. The voice on the tape stuttered. I don't know. It started after the door, after it's sealed. It's always there, whispering." Liam's gaze snapped back to the tape recorder. Whispering. He looked around the room, at the swirling floral patterns, the impossibly preserved furniture. The whispers around him weren't just in the air, they were in the carpet, in the walls, in the very fabric of this time-locked space. The thudding beneath him grew louder, a relentless, metronomic beat that felt like it was counting down to something terrifying. He realized with a chilling certainty that the room wasn't just preserved, it was alive, and it was actively resisting his presence. The carpet, so plush and inviting, now felt like quicksand, hiding a secret that was determined to make itself known, one agonizing scrape at a time. The dragging sound beneath the carpet reached a crescendo, a sickening, sustained scrape that vibrated through Liam's bones. He stumbled back from the tape player, his eyes wide with a primal fear. The voice on the tape had long since faded into a continuous loop of static, a haunting lament. But the sound in the room, that guttural dragging, was terrifyingly present. He sank back onto the burnt orange sofa, the plush fabric offering little comfort, his senses on high alert. He felt trapped, not just by the sealed doorway, but by the very environment that surrounded him. "Get out," a voice hissed from somewhere near the record player. It was a dry, crackling sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. Liam jumped, looking in the direction of the voice. Nothing. Only the impassive record player, the stack of spectral tapes. But the whispers weren't subtle anymore. They were sharper, more defined, a cacophony of hushed accusations and dire warnings. He couldn't make out individual words, but the malicious intent was clear. He got to his feet, a desperate need to escape surging through him. He had to find another way out, another door, a window, anything. He moved towards the back of the room, where he thought a window might be. He reached out to touch the wall, his fingers searching for a latch, a seam, anything that suggested an exit. The floral wallpaper felt strangely yielding, almost yielding. He pushed against it, and to his astonishment, his hand sank in slightly. He yanked his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. The wallpaper was intact, no tears, no holes, yet he had felt it. A momentary give before the wall snapped back to its rigid, solid state. It was as if the room itself was playing tricks on him, manipulating his perception. He looked around, a growing disorientation setting in. Had he come into this room from the basement? Yes, he was sure of it. But where was the opening? He walked back across the thick carpet, the dragging sound now a dull throb beneath his feet. He reached the spot where he thought he had entered. The wall was solid concrete, smooth and unbroken. He pounded on it, a futile gesture born of desperation. The voices in the room seemed to laugh, a collective, breathy rustle. He turned away from the wall, his eyes scanning the room again. He noticed something he hadn't before. Another door, almost perfectly camouflaged within the floral wallpaper. It was on the opposite wall from where he'd entered, subtly outlined, but otherwise blending seamlessly. Hope surged through him. He rushed towards it, his earlier panic momentarily subsiding. He reached for the doorknob, a simple brass fixture that seemed to have survived the decades with an impossible sheen. He twisted it. It turned with a soft click. He pulled the door open, eager for escape. But what he saw on the other side was not the basement, nor the familiar hallway of his childhood home. It was another room, identical. The same faded floral wallpaper, the same avocado green shag carpet, the same burnt orange furniture. It was as if he had simply stepped from one identical box into another. His heart sank. He looked back into the room he had just left. It, too, was now identical to this new one. The doors had vanished, leaving only the seamless, swirling patterns of the wallpaper. He stood frozen, a cold dread washing over him. He was in a maze, a labyrinth of identical rooms, each one a perfect replica of the last. The whispers in the room intensified, a mocking chorus of his despair. He realized with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, he wasn't just trapped, he was in a loop, and the only way out seemed to be further in. He took a tentative step into the next room, the dragging sound, now a faint echo from the space he'd just exited. Liam's breath hitched. The realization that he had stepped from one identical room into another, seemingly dissolving the first, was dawning with a terrifying clarity. He was inside a repeating pattern, a visual echo chamber designed to disorient and entrap. He spun around, looking back. The door he had just come through was gone, swallowed by the same floral wallpaper that adorned every wall. Panic clawed at his throat, a physical tightness that made it hard to swallow. He was in a box. And then he was in another box, identical in every detail. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, feeling the familiar texture of the wall. Floral wallpaper, impossibly smooth, impossibly clean. The faint, cloying scent filled the air, more intense now, almost suffocating. He kept walking, his steps frantic but muffled by the thick shag carpet. He searched every wall, his fingers blindly tracing the patterns, desperate for any anomaly, any seam, any hint of an exit. Nothing. Just the endless, repeating floral nightmare. He stopped in the middle of the room, his chest heaving. The whispers, once a confusing murmur, were starting to solidify into something more deliberate. Lost, they seemed to chant, a soft, rustling sound that felt like it was coming from inside his own head. Forever lost. He could still feel the faint vibration beneath his feet, the subtle reminder of whatever was being dragged endlessly below. Then he saw it. Not a door, not a window, but a subtle distortion in the wall ahead of him. It was like looking through warped glass, a shimmer in the otherwise uniform pattern of the wallpaper. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he got closer, the distortion resolved itself, revealing what looked like a window. But it wasn't a window to the outside. It was a window into another room. And in that room, a man. He was sitting in an armchair, identical to the ones in Liam's room, his back partially turned towards Liam. He was wearing clothes that looked strangely familiar, like clothes he might have owned himself, but older, faded. He was staring straight ahead, his gaze fixed on something Liam couldn't see. There was an aura of profound stillness about him, a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very posture. Liam's breath caught. He hammered on the glass-like surface. "Hey! Hey you! Can you hear me?" The man didn't react. He remained seated, unmoving, a statue in an identical room. Liam pounded harder, his voice growing hoarse. "Please! You have to help me! How do I get out of here?" The whispers in Liam's own room seemed to intensify, a cruel chorus to his desperate pleas. The man in the other room remained oblivious. Liam stared, a growing horror dawning. The man's posture, the stillness, the way he seemed both present and absent, it was eerily familiar. He recognized the slump of the shoulders, the way the back of his head was shaded. It was him, or a version of him. A version trapped in the same repeating cycle, a ghost in his own personal purgatory. He pressed his face closer to the strange window, his breath fogging the surface. Was this what awaited him? An eternity of these identical rooms, watching himself, or some reflection of himself, trapped in quiet despair? The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was like looking into a mirror that showed a future he was desperately trying to avoid. And as he watched, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the man's lips. A smile that sent a fresh wave of terror through Liam. What was he smiling at? Liam stared, his face pressed against the invisible barrier that separated him from the man in the other room. The man, his own distorted reflection, remained still, his gaze fixed on some unseen point. The faint, chilling smile lingered on his lips, a silent taunt that sent tremors through Liam. Was this his fate? To become this silent, unchanging figure, forever observing his own stagnation. The whispers around him seemed to swell, a sibilant chorus of confirmation. He remembers, they seemed to sigh, a layered sound that spoke of ages. He knows. Liam recoiled from the glass, the thought of being remembered by this spectral version of himself filling him with a dread that eclipsed his fear of the room. What had he done, or what had been done to him, to end up like this? He looked back, but the window, the man, and the other room had vanished. The wallpaper was seamless again, the floral pattern an unbroken sweep of ochre and green. It was as if the entire scene had been a fleeting hallucination, a cruel trick of the shifting walls. He stumbled back, his hands raised defensively. The disorientation was overwhelming. He had been so sure he saw him, so sure it was a reflection of his own potential future. But now, it was gone. Had he imagined it? The persistent, low vibration under his feet, the oppressive silence broken only by the insidious whispers, suggested otherwise. This place was real, and it was actively trying to break him. He began to walk again, more cautiously this time. He moved with a heightened awareness, his senses straining to detect any shift, any anomaly. The floral patterns seemed to swim before his eyes, the identical nature of the room pressing in on him. He reached out and touched the wall again, fully expecting the yielding sensation he'd felt earlier, but it remained stubbornly firm. Had that too been a trick? Then he noticed a subtle difference. In the far corner, near where he thought the window had been, the wallpaper's pattern was slightly askew. The repeating flowers were just a fraction out of alignment with the ones on the adjacent wall. It was a tiny imperfection, almost imperceptible, but in this otherwise perfectly replicated environment, it screamed. He rushed towards it, excitement warring with his fear. This had to be something. A seam, a crack, a clue. He ran his fingers along the edge of the displaced pattern. It felt as solid as the rest, but he could feel a slight unevenness, a subtle ridge where the wallpaper met itself. He pressed harder, and then, with a faint click, a section of the wall shifted inwards. It wasn't a door, not a window. It was a panel, disguised as part of the wallpaper, that had slid back, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. It was too small to be a room, more like a crawl space or a service duct. But it was an opening, an escape from the suffocating repetition. He hesitated for only a moment. The whispers seemed to grow louder, laced with a note of displeasure. They were warning him, discouraging him from pursuing this new avenue. He took a deep breath, the cloying perfume of the room filling his lungs, and squeezed through the narrow opening. He braced himself for what lay beyond, but the darkness that greeted him was absolute, and the click of the panel sliding back into place behind him was the only sound he heard. The darkness was immediate and absolute, pressing in on Liam from all sides the moment the panel slid shut. He gasped for air, a futile attempt in the thick, stale atmosphere. It was colder back here too, a damp chill that seeped into his clothes and clung to his skin. He instinctively reached out, his hands searching for the reassuring solidity of the panel, but found only rough, unyielding concrete. He was enclosed, cocooned in the dark heart of the house. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating a narrow, cramped space. It was a crawl space, barely wide enough for him to turn around. Pipes ran along the ceiling, their surfaces slick with condensation. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something acrid and unpleasant, like old, decaying material. This was not a passage to freedom. This was a cavity, a forgotten space between the walls. He moved slowly, his phone beam casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and mock him. The whispers from the room outside were muffled now, a distant, indistinct hum. He could still feel the faint vibration under his feet, the unsettling reminder of the constant, rhythmic dragging. Whatever was down there, it was still at its grim work. As he crawled forward, his hand brushed against the concrete wall. It was rough, abrasive. He felt a series of nicks and gouges, scratches, deep, raw gouges in the concrete, as if something had been desperately trying to claw its way through. They weren't random marks. They seemed to form patterns, lines that ran parallel, some crossing over others. His heart began to pound again, a frantic drummer in the suffocating silence. He shone his light on the scratches, tracing their path. They were old, but distinct. Who would do this, and why? Was someone trapped here before him? Or was this the work of whatever lurked beneath those whispering carpets? He noticed that some of the scratches seemed to be concentrated in one area, as if something had been trying to break through that particular section of the wall for a very long time. He paused, listening. The only sounds were his own ragged breaths and the faint hum of the pipes. He pressed his ear against the concrete wall, straining to hear anything from the other side, from the room he had just left. Nothing but muffled silence. The panel, it seemed, was a perfect seal. He continued to move forward, his phone beam illuminating more of the scratches. They seemed to lead him, guiding him deeper into the crawlspace. He felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't a discovery. It felt like he was being led somewhere. He reached a bend in the crawlspace, and the scratches became more numerous, more frenzied. They were clustered together, forming an almost coherent pattern, like crude symbols etched into the stone. He traced one of the deeper gashes with his finger. It was rough, jagged. He could feel the gritty concrete dust under his nail. Suddenly, a faint, skittering sound echoed from somewhere deeper within the crawlspace, followed by a quick, sharp click. He froze, his blood running cold. It wasn't the dragging sound. It was something else. Something small, fast, and unseen. He swept his phone beam around wildly, but saw nothing. Just the endless concrete walls and the disturbing, clawing marks. He realized then that he wasn't alone in this cramped, dark space. And whatever was here had been here for a long time, leaving its desperate marks. Liam scrambled back from the sudden skittering sound, his phone beam sweeping wildly through the cramped crawlspace. Nothing. Just the oppressive darkness and the rough concrete walls. The clicks and rustles had stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving in their wake a silence that was even more unnerving than the noise. He pressed himself against the cold concrete, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He was trapped, and whatever shared this space with him was unseen, unheard, and clearly aware of his presence. The scratches on the wall seemed to pulse in the erratic beam of his flashlight. They weren't just marks of desperation, he realized. They were a message, a desperate history etched into the stone. He looked closer at the clustered patterns in his immediate vicinity. They looked almost like a crude map, or a sequence of symbols. He felt a pull, an intuition that these marks were trying to tell him something, to guide him. He followed the most prominent series of scratches, a winding trail that led him further into the narrow confines. The crawlspace eventually opened up slightly, the concrete giving way to a section that felt different. It was smoother, almost like metal. He shone his light on it, revealing a large circular panel flush with the wall. It was completely seamless, with no visible handles or hinges, but etched into its surface, in a much finer detail than the scratches on the concrete, were intricate, swirling patterns. They reminded him of sound waves, or perhaps ripples on water. He hesitantly reached out and touched the panel. It was cool to the touch and vibrated with a faint, almost imperceptible hum, similar to the one he'd felt from the globe light in the floral room. He pressed his ear against it, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but a low, resonant thrum. Then, gradually, other sounds began to emerge, faint and distorted, like voices heard through a thick layer of water. He recognized snippets of conversations, hushed tones, laughter, and sometimes crying. They were indistinct, fragmented, as if playing from a distant radio. But as he listened, he started to pick out familiar voices. His mother's soft murmur, his father's gruff pronouncements, even his own childish laughter. It was a cacophony of his past, all playing out behind this strange, resonating surface. This wasn't just a panel, it was a repository of sound, a place where memories were etched into the very structure of the house. He realized with a jolt that the whispers he had heard earlier, the whispers in the carpet, might have been echoes of these trapped sounds, amplified by his own fear. This entire house seemed to be a vessel for lost voices, for memories that refused to fade. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal, overwhelmed by the ghosts of his family. Were they trying to communicate with him, or was this just the house itself, endlessly replaying its history? He stayed there for a long time, lost in the fragmented echoes of his past. He realized that the dragging sound, the scratches, the shifting rooms, It was all part of a larger narrative. And this listening panel, this repository of sound, felt like a key to understanding what had happened here and what was still happening to him. Then, as he listened to a particularly clear fragment of his mother's lullaby, he heard something new, something that cut through the familiar sounds like a shard of ice. A frantic, strained voice, layered beneath his mother's singing, whispering, "They're watching. Don't let them hear." Liam jolted back from the listening panel, his heart racing. The chilling whisper, "They're watching. Don't let them hear," had cut through the familiar echoes of his past like a siren's warning. He scanned the cramped crawl space, his phone beam darting into every shadowy corner. Who were they? And who was whispering that urgent plea? The panel hummed softly, the fragmented sounds of his past now seeming to hold a new, menacing undertone. He pushed himself away from the metal surface, a new urgency propelling him. He had to get out of the crawl space, back to a place where he could think, where he could see. He retraced his steps, his hands brushing against the rough concrete, the lingering traces of the scratches, a constant reminder of the unseen presence. He found the narrow opening, the slight ridge where the panel had been. He pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The perfect seal had reasserted itself. Panic threatened to overwhelm him again. He was trapped in the dark, with unseen things and the ghosts of his family's voices. He pounded on the concrete wall, a futile, desperate act. Then, he felt a strange warmth against his hand. He looked down. A small puddle of liquid was seeping from a hairline crack in the concrete, just below where the panel had been. It was dark, viscous, and smelled faintly metallic. Blood. He recoiled, a retching sound escaping his throat. Blood. Here? In this forgotten cavity? Who was bleeding? Was it him? He checked himself, his hands flying over his body, searching for a wound, a cut. Nothing. He felt completely intact. This blood wasn't his. It was old, thick, as if it had been slowly seeping for a long time. The scratches on the wall suddenly seemed more horrific, more meaningful. This wasn't just a physical space. It was a place of torment. His phone beam wavered as he held it closer to the crack. The trickle of blood was slow but steady, forming a small, dark pool on the concrete floor. He looked up, tracing the line of the crack. It ran upwards, towards a point where the crawl space narrowed significantly, near what he assumed was the inner wall of the house. He felt a morbid fascination, a pull towards the source of this grim revelation. He carefully stepped around the puddle of blood, his feet treading gingerly on the concrete. He moved towards the source of the crack, the crawl space constricting around him. As he neared the narrowest point, he saw it. A small, metal object embedded in the concrete, almost completely obscured by dried blood and grime. It was a light switch, an old Bakelite light switch, unlike anything he had seen in the preserved room or even in the rest of the house. It looked like it belonged to a much older structure. He reached out, his fingers hesitant. The light switch was caked with dried, dark material. He could feel the sticky residue on his fingertips. He tried to twist it, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck fast, as if fused in place. The faint hum from the listening panel seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if drawing his attention to this grim discovery. He wondered what this switch controlled. Was it connected to anything in the crawlspace? Or was it a remnant of an earlier time, a forgotten fixture deliberately sealed away? He pushed harder, determined to turn it. The dried material flaked away under his pressure, revealing more of the dark, stained Bakelite. Then, with a sickening crunch, the switch gave way. A brief, blinding flash of light erupted from somewhere within the wall, followed by a sharp, agonizing pain that shot up his arm. He cried out, stumbling back, his hand throbbing. The wall was now darker around the switch, as if the sudden surge of power had burned it. And in the flash, he thought he saw it. A brief, fleeting image behind the now darkened concrete. Something that looked like a face, contorted in pain, staring out from the darkness. The blinding flash and the searing pain in his hand subsided, leaving Liam trembling in the oppressive darkness of the crawlspace. The light switch, now dark and useless, was caked in what felt like dried blood. The metallic scent was stronger than ever. He cradled his throbbing hand, a dull ache radiating from his knuckles. He had touched something he shouldn't have, something that had responded with a violent surge. The image he'd glimpsed in the brief flash, the contorted face, haunted him. It felt like a memory, not his own, but someone else's, forcibly thrust upon him. He stumbled back towards the panel, the listening sounds now seeming more intrusive than ever. His mother's soft singing was now punctuated by a harsh, grating sound, an ugly counterpoint to her gentle melody. His father's voice, usually so measured, now carried a jagged edge, like a record skipping violently. The harmony of the past had fractured. Something had changed. He pressed his ear to the panel again. The voices were no longer a unified chorus. They were arguing. Not with words he could fully decipher, but with the tone, the rhythm, the desperate urgency. His mother's voice, once a calm whisper, was now sharp, almost panicked. His father's booming baritone, usually a sound of authority, was now laced with a raw, guttural anger. They were not agreeing anymore. They were fighting. "No," his mother's voice cried out, distorted by the static, but unmistakably her. "We can't. He shouldn't be here." "He's ours," his father roared back, his voice a gravelly snarl. "He always was." Liam's blood ran cold. They were talking about him. His parents, or their spectral echoes, were arguing about his presence in this impossible place. He had always felt a disconnect with them, a sense of unspoken things. But this was something else entirely. It was a battle for his very being, playing out in the disembodied voices that filled the house. He looked back at the light switch, then at the network of scratches on the concrete. Were these arguments related to whatever violent event had happened there? Had his father's anger, his mother's fear, culminated in that bloody switch? The collective voices of the past were no longer a comforting echo of home. They were a cacophony of conflict, a testament to a buried history that was now violently surfacing. He felt a chilling realization. This house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by unresolved conflict, by a desperate disagreement that had bled into the very fabric of reality. Whatever secret his father had buried, whatever his mother had feared, it had fractured their existence. And now, it was fracturing Liam's. He pressed his ear closer to the panel, trying to decipher more of their argument. His mother's voice was pleading, laced with a terror he had never heard before. "You don't understand. It's not just a house. They listen. They change things." His father's voice, defiant and raw, cut in. "It's ours. Our sanctuary. We built it. He belongs here." Liam realized with a terrifying certainty that the argument wasn't just about him. It was about the house itself, about its nature, and about the deep, irreconcilable schism that had occurred within his own family, a schism that had trapped them all in an eternal echo. Lieben leaned against the cool concrete of the crawlspace, his mind reeling. His parents, or their spectral imprints, were locked in an eternal, violent disagreement, their voices a cacophony of shared history and profound division. "He belongs here," his father's voice boomed, a possessive, territorial growl that sent shivers down Liam's spine. "This is his inheritance." His mother's response was a choked sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "No, it's a cage. You trapped us all." The conflict was no longer just about Liam's presence. It was about the house itself, about its purpose, and about the sinister forces that seemed to inhabit it. The fragmented whispers Liam had heard earlier, the ones from the floral room, were now amplified. a chorus of unseen entities taking sides, their sibilant voices intertwining with his parents' spectral arguments. "Yes," they whispered, "he belongs." And then a different chorus, a softer, more horrified murmur. "No, he must be free." Liam realized that the house wasn't just a place that held memories. It was a place that shaped them, distorted them, and amplified them. And the conflict between his parents, whatever its origin, had become a central axis around which the house and its spectral inhabitants revolved. His father's voice, filled with a desperate need for control and possession, clashed violently with his mother's rising panic and desperate pleas for escape. He looked at the bloody light switch again. That was the point of divergence, the moment their shared reality had shattered. The pain he'd felt, the brief, searing flash, the image of that contorted face, it all pointed to a violent event, a moment of absolute despair. Had his mother tried to escape that night, to sever the connection, to cut off whatever was listening? And had his father, in his possessiveness, or perhaps in a desperate attempt to maintain control, intervened with devastating consequences? "You broke it," his mother wailed, her voice cracking. "You broke everything when you silenced her, when you shut them out." Liam's breath hitched. Her? Who was her? Was there another victim? Another voice trapped in this echoing labyrinth? The fragmented whispers around him seemed to coalesce, confirming what his mother was saying. "She tried to tell," they hissed, a collective intake of spectral breath. "She tried to break free." His father's voice, now tinged with a desperate defensiveness, rumbled. "It was necessary to protect us, to protect you." "Protect us?" his mother shrieked, her voice raw with anguish. "You destroyed us, and now you want to destroy him too?" Liam felt a profound sense of sorrow, a grief for the fractured family he had never truly known. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. His parents were haunted by each other, by their past, and by the terrible decisions that had led them to this eternal, echoing conflict. This room, this crawl space, this house, was the stage for their final, tragic play. A story they had tried desperately to erase, but which now threatened to consume him. Liam absorbed the spectral wreckage of his parents' argument, the raw emotion of their eternal conflict echoing in the claustrophobic crawlspace. His mother's terror, his father's possessive rage, the whispers of unseen entities. It was a symphony of despair. He looked at the listening panel again. The voices had subsided into a low, discordant hum, as if the spectral actors had momentarily retreated backstage. But the tension remained, palpable and suffocating. There had to be more. A resolution, or at least a final definitive statement. His gaze fell back to the reel-to-reel tape recorder in the floral room, a room he couldn't access. But what if there were other tapes, other remnants of this buried history? He remembered the stack of tapes on the cabinet. He'd only played one. There had to be others. Desperation, a newfound resolve, surged through him. He had to find them. He had to hear the full story, the one they had tried so hard to erase. He remembered the scratches on the wall, the crude symbols. He looked at them again, his eyes scanning the rough concrete, trying to piece together a pattern. They weren't random. The winding trail, the clusters, the final concentration of marks near the panel. It was a path, a map, perhaps, to something hidden. He ran his hand over the cool metal of the listening panel, his fingers tracing the intricate, wave-like patterns. He felt a subtle shift, a faint vibration that wasn't there before. He pushed against the panel, tentatively at first, then with more force. It didn't budge. But as he applied pressure near a particularly dense cluster of etched lines, he heard a soft click, a different sound than before, deeper, more resonant. He pushed again, and with a groan, the circular panel swung inwards, not smoothly, but with a protesting scrape of metal against metal. Beyond the opening, it wasn't another room, nor the oppressive darkness of the crawlspace. It was a small recessed alcove, no bigger than a closet, and within it, bathed in a soft internal light that seemed to emanate from the alcove itself, sat another tape recorder. This one was different, sleeker, though still sporting the characteristic reel-to-reel design. Beside it, on a simple shelf, lay a single, unmarked tape. Liam stepped into the alcove. The air here was strangely calm, devoid of the whispers and the oppressive atmosphere of the crawlspace. The light was gentle, almost comforting. He reached for the tape. It felt warm to the touch and strangely light. He looked at the recorder. It was already threaded, the tape positioned, waiting. It was as if it had been prepared for him, for this very moment. He raised his eyes to the back of the alcove. There, etched into the smooth, luminous surface, was a single, clear symbol. A swirling vortex, reminiscent of the patterns on the listening panel, but more defined, more potent. He knew, with an instinctive certainty, that this was it, the final piece. He took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the play button. He was about to hear the story the house refused to let die. He pressed the button. A soft whirring began, and the tape started to spin. The tape hissed softly, then began to play. The sound was clearer than anything Liam had heard before, remarkably free of static. A voice, feminine and clear, filled the small alcove. It was his mother's voice, but not the spectral, terrified echo from the listening panel. This was her voice from long ago, before the dread had consumed her, before the house had claimed her. It was the voice of a woman filled with a quiet sadness, but also a deep, unwavering love. "Liam," she began, her voice a gentle melody, "if you are hearing this, then you have come back, and perhaps you are still lost. I am so sorry, my love." Tears welled in Liam's eyes. He had never heard her speak with such raw emotion directed at him. She spoke of the house not as a prison, but as a living entity, something that fed on emotions, that warped reality. She spoke of his father's descent, his obsession with preserving their perfect life, his increasing deafness to the subtle voices that began to permeate their existence. She spoke of her own fear, her growing awareness that the house was not just a building, but a conscious entity, and the growing divide between her and his father, who refused to see, who actively silenced her warnings. She explained the light switch, not as a tool of his father, but as a desperate, failed attempt by a previous owner, a previous victim, to sever a connection, to break the loop. His father had fixed it, sealed it, burying the evidence and the pain deeper. "He thought he was protecting us," she whispered, her voice cracking, "but he was trapping us all. He locked away more than just a room, Liam. He locked away a part of himself, and in doing so, he gave them more power." The them she referred to were the unseen entities, the whispers, the shifting walls, the very essence of the house's sentience. She spoke of her own slow fading, her essence being absorbed by the house to fuel its illusions, to maintain its hold. "I couldn't stay whole, Liam. I couldn't escape. But I could leave you this, the truth." She explained how his father had built the brick wall, not as a barrier against escape, but to seal away the listening room, the place that amplified the house's influence, a place his father believed he could control. She spoke of her efforts to leave behind clues, the scratches, the displaced patterns, the faint whispers of warning on the tapes. And then, her voice grew urgent. "They are still here, Liam. The house remembers you. It wants you here. It wants to absorb you, just as it absorbed me. But it doesn't have to be your end. She described a way, a possibility, a fissure in the house's control, a moment of weakness. It involved the core of the house, the source of its power, a place she couldn't reach, but he might. She didn't explain how, not fully. It was fragmented, a desperate set of instructions woven with grief and love. Break the cycle, Liam. Don't let it consume you. Don't become the man in the other room. Find the heart. Shatter the stillness. As her voice faded, the tape hissed to a stop. The soft light in the alcove flickered, then dimmed. The sound of dragging from beneath the floorboards slowly returned, louder, more insistent. The whispers began to swell around him, no longer fragmented, but a unified, demanding chorus. "Stay," they hissed. "You belong here now." Liam stood in the dimly lit alcove, the weight of his mother's confession and her desperate hope settling upon him. He knew what he had to do. The loop was closing, but whether it was closing for him or creating an opportunity to break free remained to be seen. The house remembered him, and now he remembered the house. Make sure to subscribe for more scary stories just like this, and make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. We'll see you in the next one.